All right, guys. Today we're going to be talking about Thomas Jefferson and a couple of significant events that occurred during his presidency. Chiefly, we're going to be looking at the Louisiana Purchase, a land acquisition that more than doubled the size of the continental United States, and in many respects set the way for the United States to be able to begin moving west. And that movement west, as we will see as we go through this course, is going to be a significant aspect of American history, something that John L. O'Sullivan will come to refer to in the 1840s as manifest destiny. The other thing we're going to be looking at is Jefferson's response to foreign affairs. And to better understand Jefferson's response to foreign affairs, it's important to understand what had been going on with foreign affairs under the Washington and Adams administration. And so when I get done with this slide, before you move on to the first slide of actual text, I want you to click on Jefferson's name, and there's a video there where a gentleman's going to be providing you with an overview of Washington's foreign policy. He's going to cover such things as the Neutrality Proclamation, which we issued in response to the French Revolution and the calls by the French for United States aid. He will also be looking at Washington's farewell address. Okay, so make sure you take a look at that before moving on to the next slide. But before you do that, let me cover just some basic things. Jefferson is elected president in 1800. And this is a really significant election because it's the first time in U.S. history where one political party, the Federalists, will have to relinquish power to a different set of political parties. In this case, it would have been the party of Jefferson. Now, the terminology for Jefferson's party can get a little bit tricky. He was referred to in the time as a Republican. Some refer to him now as a Democratic Republican. But because these terms have very different meanings today than they did back then, I simply refer to Jefferson as a Jeffersonian and those who follow him as Jeffersonians. Okay? Let me read something to you real quick about this election. It said the election of 1800 marked a turning point in American political history. It was the first time that one political party, however ungracefully, relinquished power to the opposition. Jefferson's victory signaled the end of the patrician politics of the past and the emergence of a new, more democratic political system dominated by parties, partisanship, and wider public participation. And this is at least true for white men. Okay? In some respects, Thomas Jefferson was understood and seen by many as the people's president, although Jefferson was far from like other common people. This is a slaveholder who owns a plantation. Although he's in mass debt, he lives as though he has a significant amount of money. And so, Jefferson is far from the common man's president, but he seems more in line with that way of thinking than, say, Adams did. In fact, John Adams came off as a bit of an elitist, particularly after the Alien and Sedition Acts, which basically said that you couldn't criticize the government. And John Adams ultimately is a bit petty. Indeed, at the very end of his presidency, John Adams, who's about to lose the presidency to Jefferson, will appoint a number of what we call midnight judges to the judiciary, attempting to set that branch of the government up with what he called good Federalists. Okay, recognizing, as was the case at the time in 1800, that the presidency and the Congress were no longer held by the Federalist Party. Okay, it goes on to state that, however, the fierce political battles of the late 1790s, culminating in Jefferson's election as president, wrestled control of politics from the governing elite and established the right of ordinary people to play an active role in governing the young republic. And so this is a significant move in the United States, as Jefferson will take control of the White House, or the President's Mansion, as it was known at that time. Now, at this time, socially, economically, the majority of people are still living off the land. Most people in the United States are farmers, but there is some changes taking place. And before we move into Jefferson, I want to talk briefly or read to you a section of this book, America: A Narrative History, that talks about some industrial changes. It says here that while most people continue to wrest their living from the land, a rising number of young adults found employment in new or greatly expanded enterprises: textiles, banking, transport, publishing, retail, teaching, preaching, medicine, law, construction, and engineering. Technological innovations such as steam power, power tools, and new modes of transportation, and their social applications such as mass communication, fostered an array of new industries and business. The emergence of a factory system transformed the nature of work for many Americans. Now, later on, we're going to be talking about industrial development, but just recognize that the United States had begun to industrialize to a degree by the time Jefferson becomes president in 1800. Okay? All right, with that bit of an introduction, let's just dive right into Mr. Jefferson. All right, now, a number of important events actually occur during Jefferson's administration. In fact, the United States is going to have its first war with the Barbary Pirates, and there's going to be a significant court case come down known as Marbury v. Madison, where the Supreme Court is going to grant itself judicial review. There's just quite a bit that occurs during Thomas Jefferson's 2 terms as president. But there's 2 that I want to talk about today. And the reason why I want to talk about them, one is the Louisiana Purchase, and one is the problems of impressment and some issues that the United States was having with the British and the French, is because both of these events, both of these situations, are going to have long-lasting consequences for the United States. For the Louisiana Purchase, as mentioned earlier, it's going to pave the way for America's manifest destiny. It's going to allow the United States access to lands east of the Appalachians, east of the Mississippi, where we can move west. And then the other issue, impressment, and the various issues we are having with foreign policy with the British, as you now are aware of because you watched the film. These were ultimately going to boil over into the War of 1812 under James Madison's administration. So for those reasons, I choose to look at these 2 topics, okay? All right, it says here that in Thomas Jefferson's mind, the first order of business as president was the establishment of a, quote, wise and frugal government, which shall restrain men from injuring one another, but which would otherwise leave them alone to regulate their own affairs. This, of course, is very Jeffersonian. As you might recall with the debates between Jefferson and Hamilton, Hamilton is much more in line with being intrusive in the lives of other people, right? He views the common man as incapable of running the government. Indeed, Hamilton is all about allowing the elite to govern, right? And so, Hamilton's going to try and bring about a much larger government. Well, when Jefferson comes in, he wants to restrain that government. And in some respects, Jefferson is going to make changes to the government that he's going to have to immediately undo. For example, he's going to reduce the size of the Navy because it was costing too much money. Jefferson is also of the opinion, by the way, that a standing army and navy is a dangerous thing because if you have a standing army and navy during a time of peace, Jefferson is confirmed in his belief through the Whiskey Rebellion and the tax on whiskey that armies will simply be used to become tax collectors. And the Whiskey Rebellion simply proved that. So he's going to try and restrict the armed forces, but unfortunately, when we go to war against the Barbary states, he's going to have to actually increase the size of the Navy, recognizing, as he did, that you cannot have such a small military that you can't defend yourself, okay? But ultimately, that's his objective, is to live within the constraints of the Constitution and to have a government that basically leaves people to their own affairs. He wanted a government that would respect the authority of individual states, operate with a smaller bureaucracy, and ultimately cut its debts, which, as we saw under Alexander Hamilton, debt was something that he thought was good. And Hamilton said that debt is a good thing so long as it's not too large. Of course, Hamilton at one time also called the Constitution a worthless piece of paper because he didn't get as large of a government as he wanted. But there you have it. Jefferson wants to live without debt. Of course, today our debt is fairly large. I think even Hamilton would have to concede that maybe that wasn't the greatest thing. But nonetheless, this is where Jefferson wants to go. Okay, let's move on. Jefferson also felt that the country should eliminate Hamilton's standing army by relying on a, quote, disciplined militia, which would have come from each state, for national defense against invasion. Says most importantly, he believed that good government would promote, quote, the encouragement of agriculture. Okay, now, Jefferson is not like Hamilton. Jefferson does not want to see a nation of industrialists, right, of factory systems. In fact, what the United States becomes, particularly in the North, is not what Jefferson has in mind. That's not the value for the United States that he has in mind, right? But as we even read here in this lecture, people are beginning to find work in banking and textiles and new technologies and new industries, and the factory system are beginning to develop. And Jefferson may have sort of a backward idea about how the nation should be, because the tide of history is such that his agricultural republic is going to eventually have to give way, and in fact it does give way, to an industrialized mercantilist sort of system. Okay, but that's what Jefferson has in mind. So this is Jefferson's goal when he comes into the presidency. Smaller government, and the economy, the commerce, should be based upon agriculture as opposed to industry. Okay, but even at this time, the tides of history are moving against Jefferson's utopic ideal. So let's move on. Okay, in order to obtain this type of government and to live within the constraints of the government that Jefferson says he wants, he, one, reduces, though not substantially, the 316 employees subject to presidential appointment, okay, which means there's fewer bureaucrats, okay, while leaving intact most of the nation's 700 clerks and 3,000 postal workers. The Army was cut to 2 regiments, 1 infantry and 1 artillery, okay, less than 4,000 people total. Which he also made similar reductions in the Navy, but as already mentioned, once we go to war with the Barbary pirates, that's going to have to change. He pressured Congress to abolish the direct tax of 1798 and to repeal the Alien and Sedition Acts, which which John Adams had passed. It says, to emphasize his opposition to the acts, Jefferson personally pardoned the 10 victims of those laws who were still in prison. It says, even after paying $15 million in cash for the Louisiana Purchase, the national debt fell to $57 million during his 2 years of service. Now, that's what Jefferson wants. This is what Jefferson's going to try to do. What's interesting, however, is that the 2 things that we're going to talk about today are, in many respects, the complete opposite of Jeffersonian ideology. Purchasing the Louisiana Purchase was not something that the president was constitutionally allowed to do, and indeed, Jefferson acted in some respects against his own philosophies, right? There was major debate between Jefferson and Hamilton about whether there were these things called implied powers. Implied powers meaning that the Constitution doesn't expressly say that a president or a Congress has the right to do X, Y, and Z, but the spirit of the Constitution. It's implied that the Constitution gives the powers to the president, right? Well, nothing in the Constitution gives Jefferson the right to purchase land, and it definitely doesn't give him the right to incorporate it into the United States as territories. But he does it anyways. And so he sort of works against his own philosophy. On the same token, eventually, Jefferson, because of the impressment that's going on by the British, and impressment, by the way, is when the British sailors, or any sailor for that matter, but the British Navy would stop American ships, and they would take sailors from American ships. They might commandeer the cargo and the crew. And, of course, you know, one nation cannot do this to another nation without the threat of, you know, repercussion. Now, for the British, you know, one could give them some apology here, because many British soldiers were riding along on American naval ships and on commerce ships, and so yeah, the British were perhaps capturing their own men back. But this will ultimately lead to some tension for the United States and our foreign policy, as you saw with the film on Washington already. And Jefferson's going to implement something known as the Embargo Act. And this actually is going to hurt the Southern constituency that he was understood to have represented best. And so again, you know, Jefferson has his specific ideals, but what he does doesn't always live up to them. So let's go ahead and take a look briefly at the Louisiana Purchase, and then we'll briefly look at the Embargo Act, and then we'll go on from there. All right, so let's move on. Okay, so the Louisiana Purchase. This is going to be one of those times where I'm not necessarily going to follow all of the text here on the slide, so just follow along with me. The Louisiana Purchase is bought in 1803 for about $15 million from Napoleon Bonaparte. Napoleon is probably, well, without question, I think he could be arguably the best general that France has ever seen, perhaps the best the world has ever seen. But Napoleon is a product of the French Revolution. He had been part of the revolutionary movement, and following the French Revolution, Napoleon basically begins to take over Europe. And this is going to bring France into conflict with Great Britain. And indeed, by 1803, 1804, and indeed Napoleon, by the way, will crown himself emperor of France in 1804, which sort of negates the whole purpose behind the French Revolution, but that's for a different lecture and indeed a different class. But Napoleon's attempt to conquer Europe brings him into conflict with Great Britain. And by 1803, 1804, what you find is that a stalemate has come into existence. The British have proven that they are superior with their navy, while the French have proved superior with their land forces. And neither country is able to defeat the other, at least not completely. And so by the early 1800s, by the time Jefferson becomes president, the two nations begin to try and fight one another through the process of destroying each other's economy. And what they do to do that is they try to stop and halt commerce that goes in and out of the country. Now, the United States had been engaged in trade and commerce with both France and Great Britain. The United States is a neutral nation, right? They don't need to pick a favorite here. They can trade with both sides. But neither France nor Britain wants us trading with their enemy, and so they begin to impress our ships. They begin to do various things that's going to irritate, to say the least, the United States, which will ultimately lead to Jefferson passing the Embargo Act and the War of 1812. But the reason why I say all that is because in 1803, Napoleon is going to make a decision to sell off a significant tract of land that we now know as the Louisiana Territory. And he's going to do this because he needs revenue, money, that is, to fight his war against Great Britain. Okay, so that gives you a little bit of back history there. Now let me go through this pretty quickly so you can get a sense of what the territory was. It says, during the colonial era, the French had settled the Louisiana Territory, which is why today, if you go to Louisiana, especially in New Orleans, there is a significant French influence there, Creole influence. It says, but in 1763, France had ceded Louisiana to Spain. And for the most part, when Spain held control of the area, the United States was on friendly terms with Spain. And so the United States and the Spanish had an agreement that the United States could pretty much use the port of New Orleans, and they could trade and they could have commerce through the port of New Orleans. That was okay. There wasn't going to be a problem for that. And New Orleans is a significant port because it was one of the very few southern ports that the United States had access to. Okay? Well, around 1800, Napoleon attempts to take this territory back, the New Orleans, the Louisiana area back. And this posed a bit of a concern for the United States, in particular Jefferson, because if the French wanted to, they could cut off America's access to the port of New Orleans, and this would have severely hurt America's economy. And so there's this concern by Jefferson and many within his administration that the French could potentially pose a problem, right? Could pose a problem for America's economy. Now, why does Napoleon want this territory back? Well, that's a great question. And I'm going to move on to the next slide, and I'm going to continue this conversation. Okay, so the reason why Napoleon wants this material, or not this material, the reason why Napoleon wants this territory is because he wants to create a sugar empire in what is now the mid portion of the United States. And in order to do this, the French under Napoleon is going to have to take control of a colony that the French had at one time held possession of, but then they lost possession of. There was a slave revolt in Haiti, where the slaves revolted, ousted their French colonials, and took control over Haiti. Well, Napoleon attempts to recapture Haiti because the main export commodity out of Haiti is sugar. And again, what Napoleon is trying to do is, through recapturing Haiti, he then wants to create the sugar empire in what was the Louisiana Territory. Well, Napoleon ultimately loses. He does not recapture Haiti. And being unable to gain control of the natural resource of sugar to send into what he wants is his sugar empire, he simply decides that instead of holding on to this land, he's going to sell it in order to acquire some type of resources, again, to fight off the British. Okay. And so we're going to begin negotiations with the French over this land that we now know as the Louisiana Territory. Now, initially, we didn't want the entire Louisiana Territory. We just wanted Louisiana and New Orleans. We just wanted access to the port. Indeed, one of the things that Jefferson was concerned about was that if the French took control of the New Orleans port, the United States would have to ally themselves with the British, because the British had a significant navy that could apply pressure to the French that would allow us to continue access to New Orleans. But that's not what we decided to do. Instead, we decided to negotiate with the French, and so to do this, Jefferson will send Robert Livingston to France to negotiate a trade. Eventually, James Monroe will meet up with Robert Livingston, and Napoleon will eventually sell the entire Louisiana Territory to the United States for $15 million. I think it was something like 4 cents an acre. This was the greatest land deal in all of U.S. history, and it doubled the size of the country at that time. Okay, moving on. Okay, so it says here that the treaty, and this is how the Louisiana Purchase was initially purchased. It was purchased through something known as the Treaty of Cession. And that Treaty of Cession, as you see here, was formed on April 30th, 1803. Now, Jefferson was not actually aware of the Treaty of Cession initially. He became aware of it after the fact, after Livingston and Monroe had negotiated the sale. But the treaty was pretty vague. It didn't define boundary points very well. But basically what it did was it encompassed the entire Mississippi River Valley west of the actual Mississippi River. And I have a map coming up that you'll be able to see exactly what that looked like. Okay, but greatest land deal in American history, and perhaps of all of history, for that matter. But the purchase itself presented a constitutional problem, because nowhere in the Constitution is the president granted the right to purchase land. Now, presidents do have the right to negotiate treaties, and because this was negotiated as a treaty, Jefferson will eventually be convinced, I think rather grudgingly, that he did have a constitutional right to do this purchase because of the fact that he as president could do this as a treaty. But I'll talk more about that in a second. Let's go ahead and take a look at that map. Okay, we can see here the red portion would be the Louisiana Purchase. $15 million, quite a good land grab. Grabbed portions of what would become Texas, Arkansas, Oklahoma, Louisiana, Missouri, Iowa, Kansas, Colorado, Wyoming, South and North Dakota, as well as Montana. Okay, and a little bit of Illinois. Okay, and perhaps a little bit of Tennessee as well. At any rate, significant land acquisition. Now, following this purchase, Jefferson is going to send out 2 individuals, Lewis and Clark. You've probably heard of the Lewis and Clark expedition. They will refer to themselves as the Corps of Discovery, and they will move across all this territory. They will actually make it to the Pacific Ocean, and along the way, the Lewis and Clark expedition will come into contact with various native peoples. They will discover a bunch of new species of plants and animal life, and they will write their findings in a book called The Diaries of the Lewis and Clark Expedition, or the Corps of Discovery. One of the things I want to mention about Lewis and Clark is that their encounters with native people, including their guide Sacagawea, proved to them that natives were not as many white people described them. They were not barbaric savages. They were not beasts, right? And in many respects, the narrative that Lewis and Clark presented about Native Americans completely contradicted the larger notion of an unassimilable group of people who were barbarians and backwards. Okay, unfortunately, that particular way of thinking doesn't take root, and Native peoples will still be regarded as inferior and what have you. It's a completely horrific, thing to overlook, when they say that they're not barbaric, but we continue to think of them as such. But that was how people were at the moment. But $15 million, you get this large land. Lewis and Clark, they go and explore it, and they get all the way through Oregon, and they will come back. It takes them about 2 years to do this. And again, you can read the journals of Lewis and Clark and see exactly what it was that they found. In part, Jefferson sent out Lewis and Clark because he was interested in the flora and fauna. I mean, Jefferson had many different interests, and one of them was flora and fauna and nature and science and what have you. And so he wanted to know what was out there. And the taxpayers paid for this, by the way. Congress appropriated the monies for this expedition, and it eventually cost a lot more than the Lewis and Clark than they initially thought it would be, which was $2,500, and ended up being way more than that. But there you have it. So we have this land. We've explored it. It takes a couple years to do so. But again, I want to mention again this dilemma that Jefferson finds himself in. So let's move to that now. Okay, it says the Louisiana Purchase, known as the Noble Bargain. The purchase succeeded in accomplishing two things. First, it created a new empire of liberty, which is what Jefferson was quoted as saying, and he thought it was an empire of liberty again because this was land that could be used for agriculture. But it also presented Jefferson with a constitutional dilemma. It says, as a strict constructionist, Jefferson had to come to the realization that nowhere in the Constitution was the president granted the right to purchase territory. And, you can be sure that critics would have been railing against him, right? You claim to be a strict constructionist, Jefferson. You claim that you can only do what the Constitution expressly says, but you just purchased the land with one fell swoop of the pen on the check, and yet nowhere in the Constitution does it say this. Now, it says to resolve the problem, Thomas Jefferson looked to amend the Constitution. But advisors warned Jefferson that such an action would be time-consuming, and he did not want to give Napoleon an opportunity to change his mind. Okay? So ultimately, what's going to happen? Let's go to the next slide. It says, in the end, Jefferson relented on his dilemma and accepted, only half-heartedly though, that the power was implied and was found in the president's right to make the treaties, which would have been Article 2, Section 2, Clause 2. Now, ultimately, the United States Senate would ratify the Louisiana Purchase, or the Treaty of Cession. And they would do this on December 20th, 1803, in a vote 26-6. And the Louisiana Purchase, again, it's significant because it opens up a vast amount of land for Americans to begin to move west. And as we will see, once people begin to move west, they're going to raise some significant concerns. One, they're going to come into contact with Native Americans, and there will be a process of Indian removal as the white man begins to fulfill his manifest destiny and move west. But as new states are created out of the Louisiana Territory, it's also going to raise some very fiery conversations about the institution of slavery and its westward expansion. And in fact, I will argue that it is the westward expansion of slavery that causes the Civil War. So while Jefferson should not be blamed for starting the Civil War, the Louisiana Purchase very well contributed to the debates about westward expansion because it provided the United States the land with which to move west. Okay? And so that's why I think this is an incredibly significant event in U.S. history because of its impact upon the coming Civil War. Not to mention, it also had a significant impact on cartography, the development of maps of what the continent looked like. It also provided opportunity to understand the nature, flora, and fauna of the region, and had scientific applicability as well. So that's sort of Louisiana Purchase in a nutshell. There's a lot more we could talk about, but I don't want to beat this to death. I think that that's probably sufficient for now. So with that, let's move on to our next topic, which is going to be looking at how Jefferson will continue to respond with the British and the French. Again, remembering that both Washington and Adams have already dealt with these issues, Jefferson is going to continue. Okay, it says several weeks after buying Louisiana, Napoleon declared war on Great Britain. At first, the European fighting benefited the United States since Americans functioned as the merchants carrying supplies to the warring powers. In fact, I've already mentioned this a little bit, but again, Napoleon and the French, they're going after each other, and this is a perfect opportunity for the United States to be able to grow its economy. It says, consequently, between 1803 and 1807, total U.S. exports jumped from 66.5 million to 102.2 million. This service provided by American ships often involved re-exporting, meaning European and colonial goods were picked up by American ships for transport to U.S. ports, where they were reloaded onto other U.S. ships for export to Europe. It says during the same 4-year period, re-exports quadrupled, rising from 13.5 million to 58.4 million. Then the bottom fell out of the trade industry as England and France each independently outlawed virtually all American commerce with their opponent. The point of all these numbers is simply to demonstrate and highlight, and anecdotally, that the United States was making a lot of money off of the war that Britain and France were having with each other. But as it says, the bottom then bursts out. As France and Britain come to a stalemate, they recognize that if I can't beat you with guns and ships, then maybe we can cripple you by damaging your economy. And this, of course, is going to directly affect the United States, who had been engaging in economic commerce with both countries, right? If they want to shoot each other, we'll sell whatever it is that you want to shoot each other with, right? It doesn't matter to me who's shooting whom as long as we're selling whatever the commodities are. But France and Britain are going to try and fight this war economically by halting America from engaging in commerce with both sides. And this is going to raise some really significant questions about America's sovereignty, right? Does a nation like France, does a nation like Britain have the right to tell another sovereign nation that they can't commerce with somebody, that they can't engage in trade with somebody else? And that's the central question, or at least one of the central questions, that Jefferson, Adams, and Washington have all had to deal with. It's a question that Madison will have to deal with. And ultimately, it's not going to get resolved but through war. And in 1812, the United States will declare war against Great Britain for the second time, a kind of second war of independence, if you will. But before we get to the War of 1812, let's look and see how Jefferson seeks to deal with this. Okay, it says here that the British Navy also began seizing American ships with cargoes bound for Europe and impressing American sailors into the Royal Navy. This is what we call impressment. It says the problem partly stemmed from the practice of British sailors jumping ship to join U.S. merchant vessels. And as I mentioned before, oftentimes the British are stopping these American merchant vessels because they are aware of, or at least believe, there might be British sailors on board. And so, in fact, the British may well be taking their own back, not necessarily capturing Americans, but they're still stopping American merchant vessels and basically not playing very nice. And since thousands of such deserters were considered fair prey by the British Navy, which also routinely impressed American citizens on the pretext that they were British deserters, many of whom were in fact just that. It says tensions mounted, and in the summer of 1807, the British warship Leopard fired on the American naval frigate Chesapeake, killing 3 Americans. It says when the ship refused boarding orders, and then cries for war erupted throughout the nation. And indeed, there were groups of people known as war hawks Henry Clay being chief among them, who are calling for Jefferson to go to war with Great Britain over this abuse of power. Now, there are other reasons why war hawks are calling for war. Those reasons will be spelt out later, but some of them include there is a desire among the United States to acquire more territory in Canada, which at the time Britain had a significant control over, because in 1807, 1808, the borders weren't set. And there's also a belief that the British, and I think that there is legitimacy to this claim, that the British are inciting Indian raids in the United States. And so for these reasons, war hawks are calling for war, right? And there's already been calls for war under Washington's administration. There was calls to go to war during John Adams's administration, particularly during the XYZ affair, where 3 French diplomats sought a bribe from the United States, and this was a smack in the face. Washington and Adams chose not to go to war. They chose to remain neutral and, according to Washington, impartial. Jefferson's going to respond similarly in that he doesn't go to war, but he does something rather dumb, and that is that he cuts off trade to Europe. And this is going to hurt the American economy. Okay, so Jefferson's response is that it says Jefferson banned all British ships from U.S. ports, ordered state governors to prepare to call up 100,000 militiamen, and suspended trade with all of Europe. And this was called the Embargo Act. The Embargo Act was his suspension of trade with Europe. And basically what Jefferson reasoned, his logic behind this was this. He believed that U.S. farm products were crucial to France and England, and that a complete embargo would bring them to respect U.S. neutrality. You see, what the problem was is that embargoing France and Britain, and not just them, in fact, all of Europe, it didn't hurt the European economy. Instead, it hurt the American economy. It says by spring 1808, however, the Embargo Act that was passed by Congress in December 1807 had devastated the American economy, dropping its exports from $108 million to $22 million in 1 year, less than a year. And so, Jefferson, who is the common man's buddy, right, here, who he's hurting predominantly are Southern farmers. The Northerners were damaged by this, but they had ways to get around it. They could circumnavigate this a little bit. Not legally, but they did circumnavigate it. Southern farmers had no way to get rid of the commodities that they were growing based upon the Embargo Act. And so Jefferson damages the American economy. In an attempt to be diplomatic, I mean, Jefferson kept his head. He doesn't go to war, and I don't think he should have gone to war at this time. But his Embargo Act isn't helpful either, because it really damages the overall American economy. Okay, let's move on. It states here that economic desperation settled upon the mercantile Northeast. Finally, Jefferson backed off in the last months of his administration, and by this point, this is Jefferson's second term in office, and Congress will repeal the Embargo Act, and they will replace it with something called the Non-Intercourse Act, which opened trade with Europe except for England and France. Okay, it says eventually the trade war would propel America into a fighting war with England during the administration of James Madison, and that's where we're going to get the War of 1812. Okay, so where the Louisiana Purchase had consequences that would develop over a period of time, the Embargo Act and Jefferson's response to foreign affairs, much like Washington's and Adams, is going to have a more immediate effect. And Madison, frankly, he's going to try to be diplomatic for a hot minute, but he's going to be forced into war himself. And the irony of it, though, is that we actually didn't need to go to war in 1812 because the British had, in fact, decided to come to our way of thinking. But unfortunately, the news of their willingness to work with us didn't reach us in time, and we declared war on them by the time we found out that they were willing to play nice. So, but that's sort of Jefferson in a nutshell. And again, there's a lot more that we could say. There's a lot more that we probably ought to talk about with Jefferson. There's so much there, but for the sake of time, we'll go ahead and leave it at that. So, with that, go in peace, be warm and filled. May the force be with you, and live long and prosper.